Joseph Stalin, the Iron Leader of the Soviet Union. Picture this. A small, pockmarked man with a withered arm stands before a mirror in the Kremlin, practicing his signature. He signs the same name over and over again, but it's not the name his mother gave him. No, Josip Vissarionis Dzyughashvili disappeared long ago, replaced by something far more terrifying. He signs Stalin, which means man of steel. And on this particular night in 1937, he's signing death warrants. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. He pauses occasionally to smoke his pipe, sometimes drawing a casual doodle in the margin next to a name, before continuing. By the time dawn breaks over Moscow, he will have condemned more people to death than most serial killers could imagine in their darkest fantasies. But Stalin isn't a serial killer. He's something far more dangerous. He's a man who transformed an entire nation into his killing machine. And tonight, we're going to uncover how a dirt-poor boy from the edge of the Russian Empire became one of the most powerful and feared dictators in human history. Our story begins not in the grand halls of the Kremlin, but in a one-room shack in Gori, Georgia, in 1878. The Caucasus region was a world away from the glittering palaces of St. Petersburg, a rough place where blood feuds still settled disputes and poverty was as common as the mountain air. Young Josep, or So-So, as his mother called him, was born into circumstances that would have crushed most people's ambitions before they even formed. His father, Bessarion, was a cobbler who made more acquaintance with vodka bottles than shoe leather, and when he drank, his fists flew. The beatings were so severe and so frequent that they became part of So-So's earliest memories. His mother, Kiki, tried to shield her son, but she herself suffered under Bessarion's violence. Eventually, his father abandoned the family altogether, leaving them in desperate poverty. But here's where the story takes its first fascinating turn. Kiki Galadze was a woman of fierce determination. She worked her fingers raw, taking in laundry and cleaning houses, driven by a single, burning ambition. Her son would escape this life. She wanted him to become a priest. Can you imagine the irony? The woman who would raise one of history's most notorious atheists dreamed of him serving God. She managed to get So-So enrolled in the Gori church school, and against all odds, he excelled. The boy had a gift. He possessed a photographic memory that let him absorb information like a sponge. He sang beautifully in the choir. He wrote poetry that was actually quite good, some of it even published in Georgian literary journals. For a brief moment, it seemed Kiki's dream might come true. In 1894, at age 16, Stalin won a scholarship to the Tiflis Theological Seminary, the most prestigious religious school in Georgia. But here's what's crucial to understand about this moment. The seminary wasn't just a place of prayer and contemplation. It was a hotbed of revolutionary thinking. The Russian Empire was creaking under its own weight, and everywhere, people were reading forbidden books, passing around illegal pamphlets, whispering about change. The seminary tried to control its students with brutal discipline, conducting surprise searches of rooms, forbidding Georgian language and culture in favor of Russian domination, punishing any hint of independent thought. But you know what happens when you try to suffocate young minds? They find ways to breathe. And So-So discovered his oxygen in the underground world of revolutionary literature. Picture the scene. Late at night, after the monks have made their rounds, young Stalin huddles under his blanket with a forbidden book, reading by candlelight about Karl Marx and revolutionary socialism. He's discovering ideas that will reshape the world. The books speak of a coming revolution, of workers rising up against their oppressors, of a world where the poor wouldn't just survive but rule. For a boy who grew up dodging his father's fists and watching his mother's hands crack and bleed from washing other people's clothes, these ideas ignited something profound. This wasn't just political theory. This was personal. Stalin got expelled from the seminary in 1899, though the exact reasons remain murky. Some say he missed exams. Others claim he was caught with revolutionary literature. What matters is what happened next. At age 21, Josep Dzyughashvili made a choice that would echo through history. He became a professional revolutionary, not a priest, not a poet, a revolutionary. And in the violent, conspiratorial world of turn-of-the-century Russia, that meant becoming someone entirely new. He needed a code name, a revolutionary identity. He tried several, but the one that stuck was Stalin. The man of steel had been born. Now here's where we need to understand something crucial about the revolutionary underground in Russia. These weren't just people sitting around having philosophical discussions over tea. This was dangerous, violent work. The Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, were everywhere, and they were good at their jobs. Revolutionaries got arrested, exiled to Siberia, executed. To survive, you had to be smart, ruthless, and absolutely committed. Stalin proved to be all three. Between 1902 and 1913, he was arrested 8 times and exiled to Siberia 6 times. Each time, he escaped. Let that sink in. The man escaped from Siberian exile 6 times. We're talking about one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, and he just kept walking out. But Stalin wasn't just evading the police. He was making a name for himself in the revolutionary movement by doing the dirty work that intellectuals found distasteful. While other Bolsheviks debated theory in comfortable European cafes, Stalin was in the Caucasus organizing bank robberies to fund the revolution. The most famous was the 1907 Tiflis bank robbery, where his squad killed dozens of people and made off with a fortune. This was terrorism by any definition, but in Stalin's mind, it was warfare. The ends justified the means, a philosophy that would define his entire life. And here's the thing, Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik faction, noticed. Sure, Stalin wasn't an intellectual. He didn't write brilliant theoretical treatises, but he got things done. He was loyal. He was effective. He was exactly the kind of man Lenin needed. By 1912, Lenin promoted Stalin to the Bolshevik Central Committee. It was during this period that Stalin met his first wife, Kato Svanidze. By all accounts, he genuinely loved her, and their marriage produced a son, Yakov. But in 1907, Kato died of typhus, and something in Stalin died with her. He was heard to say at her funeral that any warm feelings he had left in his heart died with her. His second marriage years later to Nadezhda Alliluyeva would be marked by cruelty and emotional abuse, ending with her apparent suicide in 1932. The man who would control millions of lives couldn't maintain a loving relationship with the women closest to him. Then came 1917, and everything changed. The Russian Empire, already bleeding from World War I, collapsed. The February Revolution toppled the Tsar. Suddenly, after centuries of autocratic rule, Russia was free. But freedom is chaotic, and chaos is opportunity. Stalin was in Siberian exile when the revolution happened, but he rushed back to Petrograd. The Bolsheviks were still a minority party, but they were organized, disciplined, and led by the brilliant strategist Lenin. Stalin worked behind the scenes, editing the party newspaper, Pravda, and doing organizational work. He wasn't flashy like Leon Trotsky, who was electrifying crowds with revolutionary speeches. Stalin was the man in the back room, keeping track of who was loyal, who was useful, who might be a problem later. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks made their move. In what they called the October Revolution, they seized power in a coup. And suddenly, these revolutionaries who had spent years plotting from the shadows were running the largest country on earth. But winning power and keeping power are two very different things. Russia descended into a brutal civil war that would last until 1920, pitting the Bolshevik Red Army against the White Army, which was backed by foreign powers. Millions died from combat, disease, and famine. And in this crucible of violence, Stalin continued to do what he did best, whatever was necessary. He was sent to various fronts as a political commissar, where he gained a reputation for ruthless effectiveness and complete disregard for casualties. When generals didn't deliver results, he had them shot. When cities didn't surrender quickly enough, he starved them. He was learning that terror was a tool of government. The Bolsheviks won the Civil War, but at a catastrophic cost. Russia was devastated, its economy in ruins, its people exhausted. Lenin, the father of the revolution, was dying from a series of strokes. And here's where the great succession struggle begins, one of the most consequential political battles in history. On one side was Leon Trotsky, brilliant orator, architect of the Red Army, intellectual powerhouse, Lenin's right-hand man in the revolution. Everyone assumed Trotsky would be Lenin's successor. But on the other side was Stalin, holder of a position that everyone had overlooked, General Secretary of the Communist Party. It sounded like a boring administrative job. It was actually the key to everything. Lenin, before he died in 1924, actually wrote a testament warning the party about Stalin. He wrote, "Comrade Stalin has concentrated enormous power in his hands, and I am not sure that he always knows how to use that power with sufficient caution." Lenin even suggested Stalin should be removed from his position. But here's the brilliance of Stalin's strategy. By the time Lenin died, Stalin controlled the party apparatus. He decided who got promoted, who got assigned where, who attended which meetings. He had spent years building a network of loyalists. Trotsky had given fiery speeches. Stalin had been making friends and taking names. The power struggle played out over several years, and Stalin proved to be a master of political manipulation. He first allied with Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev against Trotsky, painting Trotsky as an arrogant intellectual out of touch with the party. Then, once Trotsky was marginalized, Stalin turned on Zinoviev and Kamenev, allying with others to isolate them. He used his control of party positions to stack meetings with his supporters. He manipulated votes. He rewrote history, literally editing photographs to remove his enemies and insert himself into key revolutionary moments. By 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the party and would eventually be exiled from the Soviet Union. Stalin hunted him for years across the globe, until finally, in 1940, one of Stalin's agents buried an ice axe in Trotsky's skull in Mexico City. Stalin never forgot his enemies, and he never stopped until they were dead. By 1928, Stalin was the undisputed leader of the Soviet Union, and he immediately launched the most radical transformation any country has ever attempted. He called it the 5-year plan, and its goal was nothing less than to drag the Soviet Union from an agricultural backwater into an industrial superpower in just a few years. It was insanely ambitious. Western countries had taken centuries to industrialize. Stalin wanted to do it in a decade. Factories would rise across the land, massive dams would harness rivers, the Soviet Union would produce steel, machinery, weapons. But there was a problem. Where would the resources come from to pay for this industrial revolution? Stalin had an answer, and it would result in one of the greatest crimes of the 20th century. The answer was the peasants. The Soviet Union's agricultural sector would be collectivized. Private farms would be abolished. Peasants would be forced into collective farms where the state would control production. The grain they produced would be seized and either used to feed industrial workers or sold abroad to buy machinery. It was, on paper, a neat solution. In reality, it was genocide. The wealthier peasants, called kulaks, resisted collectivization. Stalin's response was to liquidate the kulaks as a class. Millions of peasant families were branded kulaks, stripped of everything they owned, and either executed on the spot or shipped to labor camps in Siberia. Entire villages were emptied. But the horror was only beginning. Collectivization was a disaster. Peasants, angry at having their land stolen, killed their livestock rather than hand it over to the collectives. Agricultural production collapsed, and Stalin's response was to squeeze even harder. He demanded unrealistic grain quotas from Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. When the collectives couldn't meet the quotas, he sent in brigades to seize every scrap of food they could find. Grain, potatoes, even seeds for next year's planting. Everything. This policy had a name, the Holodomor, which means death by hunger. Between 1932 and 1933, somewhere between 3 and 7 million people starved to death in Ukraine and other parts of the Soviet Union. Let me paint you a picture of what this meant. Mothers watching their children's bellies swell from malnutrition, their eyes growing hollow. People eating grass, tree bark, anything they could digest. Cases of cannibalism. And through it all, Soviet propaganda posters proclaimed that life was getting better, that socialism was succeeding. Stalin knew what was happening. He didn't care. Or rather, he did care, but only insofar as the famine served his purposes. It broke peasant resistance. It terrorized the population into obedience. And it provided the resources to fuel industrialization. Because here's the terrible truth. The industrialization worked. By the mid-1930s, the Soviet Union was producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons at an impressive rate. Massive construction projects like the Moscow Metro showcased Soviet achievements. To the outside world, and to many Soviet citizens, it looked like communism was working. The human cost was hidden behind propaganda and censorship. But Stalin wasn't satisfied. By the mid-1930s, despite his total control of the country, he became increasingly paranoid. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was the logical conclusion of his worldview, which saw enemies everywhere. Whatever the reason, Stalin launched what became known as the Great Terror or the Great Purge, one of the most insane episodes of political repression in history. Starting in 1936 and continuing until 1938, Stalin set out to eliminate anyone who might pose even a theoretical threat to his power. And I mean anyone. The purge began with show trials of old Bolsheviks, Stalin's former rivals like Zinoviev and Kamenev. They were hauled before court, forced to confess to absurd crimes like spying for foreign powers and plotting to kill Stalin, then executed. But the purge didn't stop with Stalin's political enemies. It spread like a virus through every level of Soviet society. Red Army generals were arrested and shot, including many who had fought in the Civil War. The military leadership was decimated. Intellectuals, artists, scientists vanished in the night. Factory managers were arrested for sabotage when production quotas weren't met. Ordinary people were denounced by neighbors, co-workers, even family members. The secret police, the NKVD, had quotas for arrests. Let that sink in. They had to arrest a certain number of people, guilty or not. People were arrested in the middle of the night, taken to prisons, tortured until they signed confessions implicating others, then either shot or sent to the Gulag labor camps in Siberia. The Gulag became a massive system of forced labor camps where millions of people worked in brutal conditions, mining gold, cutting timber, building infrastructure. Many died of cold, hunger, exhaustion. Estimates suggest that between 600,000 and 1.2 million people were executed during the Great Purge, and millions more were imprisoned. And here's the most chilling part. Stalin personally reviewed and approved thousands of execution lists. Remember that image from the beginning, of Stalin signing death warrants? That was real. He would go through lists of names, marking who would live and who would die, sometimes adding notes like, "Beat them until they confess." The paranoia reached such absurd levels that even the secret police weren't safe. Genrikh Yagoda, head of the NKVD who had implemented much of the terror, was arrested and executed. His replacement, Nikolai Yezhov, oversaw the height of the purges. Then he too was arrested and shot. The revolution was eating its children, and Stalin was sharpening the knives. But why? Why would Stalin destroy his own military leadership? His own party? His own country's intellectual and technical elite? Some historians argue it was pure paranoia. Others suggest it was a deliberate strategy to create a new Soviet elite that owed everything to Stalin, that had no memory of the revolution before him, that saw him as the source of all power and legitimacy. Stalin was reshaping Soviet society in his image, and anyone who remembered a time before Stalin was a potential threat. Then came 1939, and the world was about to explode into the most devastating war in human history. Hitler had risen to power in Germany, and Europe was teetering on the brink. Stalin had spent years denouncing fascism, and Hitler specifically. Soviet propaganda had portrayed the Nazis as the ultimate evil. So imagine the shock when, in August 1939, Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers who negotiated it, stunned the world. Communists and fascists, supposedly mortal enemies, were now partners. But the pact had a secret protocol that was even more cynical. Stalin and Hitler agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split. The Baltic states would go to the Soviet Union. Stalin was buying time and territory. In September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland from the west. 2 weeks later, Stalin invaded from the east. Poland was crushed between two totalitarian regimes. The Soviet Union then absorbed the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and attacked Finland in the Winter War. But the invasion of Finland exposed a terrible truth. The Red Army was in shambles. Stalin's purge of military leadership had left the army poorly led and unprepared. The Finns, vastly outnumbered, inflicted humiliating casualties on Soviet forces. The world watched and concluded that the Soviet military was a paper tiger, and one man was watching very carefully: Adolf Hitler. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military invasion in history, with over 3 million German soldiers pouring across the border. Stalin had received numerous warnings that the Germans were preparing to attack. Soviet spies had sent detailed intelligence. Even his own military had reported massive German troop buildups on the border. Stalin ignored it all. He was convinced Hitler wouldn't attack, that the warnings were British provocations trying to start a war. When the invasion actually began, Stalin was reportedly in shock. He disappeared to his dacha for several days, possibly expecting to be arrested by his own Politburo. But no one came for him. The country needed him, and when he finally addressed the Soviet people by radio on July 3rd, he didn't speak as the supreme leader of the Communist Party. He spoke as a Russian patriot, calling them brothers and sisters, invoking Mother Russia, appealing to nationalism rather than ideology. The first months of the war were catastrophic. The Germans advanced hundreds of miles, encircling and destroying entire Soviet armies. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. The Germans reached the outskirts of Moscow. Leningrad was surrounded and subjected to a siege that would last 872 days and kill over 1 million people from starvation and bombardment. The Soviet Union seemed on the verge of collapse, but Stalin made several crucial decisions. First, he stayed in Moscow even as German forces approached, a powerful symbol that the leadership wasn't abandoning the capital. Second, he finally started listening to competent military commanders like Georgy Zhukov instead of executing them. Third, he authorized a massive evacuation of factories and industries from the western USSR to beyond the Ural Mountains, an incredible logistical achievement that preserved Soviet industrial capacity. The war on the Eastern Front was apocalyptic in its scale and brutality. This wasn't war as the West experienced it. This was a war of annihilation. Hitler had ordered his forces to exterminate communists, Jews, and Slavic peoples. The Germans committed massive atrocities. The Soviets fought with desperate fury. Cities like Stalingrad became symbols of resistance, where soldiers fought building to building, room to room, in ruins where the snow mixed with blood. Stalin's name on the city added symbolic weight to its defense. The Battle of Stalingrad, lasting from August 1942 to February 1943, became the turning point of the war. The German Sixth Army, over 250,000 men, was surrounded and destroyed. The tide had turned. Stalin proved to be an effective war leader in many ways. He coordinated with his generals. He managed the massive mobilization of resources. He allied with Britain and America, receiving crucial supplies through Lend-Lease. But he was still Stalin. When his eldest son Yakov was captured by the Germans and Hitler offered to exchange him, Stalin refused, reportedly saying, "I have no son named Yakov." Yakov died in a German POW camp. Stalin executed or punished generals who failed or retreated. Entire ethnic groups were deported from their homelands on suspicion of collaboration with the Germans. The Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and others were packed into trains and shipped to Central Asia, with thousands dying in transit. By 1945, the Red Army had turned from defender to invader, pushing the Germans back across Eastern Europe. Soviet forces took Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna, and finally, in April 1945, Berlin itself. The Red Army's advance was marked by massive destruction and extensive atrocities against German civilians, revenge for what the Germans had done in the Soviet Union. When Soviet forces raised the red flag over the Reichstag building in Berlin on April 30th, 1945, it symbolized the end of Nazi Germany and the emergence of the Soviet Union as one of two global superpowers. The cost of victory was staggering. The Soviet Union lost approximately 27 million people in World War II, about half of them civilians. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. But Stalin emerged from the war at the height of his power and prestige. The man of steel had led his country from the brink of annihilation to victory over the Nazi war machine. In the West, he was respected as Uncle Joe, an ally against Hitler. Time magazine named him Person of the Year twice, but those who knew him understood the truth. Stalin was consolidating power over an empire. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin met with Roosevelt and Churchill to decide the fate of post-war Europe. Stalin was in his element, a skilled negotiator who got most of what he wanted. Eastern Europe would become a Soviet sphere of influence. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and later East Germany would fall under communist control. The Iron Curtain, as Churchill would later call it, descended across Europe. The Cold War had begun, and for the next 4 decades, the world would live under the shadow of potential nuclear annihilation as the Soviet Union and the United States faced off. Stalin's final years were marked by increasing paranoia and cruelty. He launched new purges. The Leningrad affair saw the execution of party leaders from Leningrad, whom Stalin suspected of plotting against him. Soviet Jews were targeted in an anti-Semitic campaign disguised as anti-cosmopolitanism. The Doctors' Plot of 1953, where prominent doctors, mostly Jewish, were accused of plotting to assassinate Soviet leaders, seemed like a prelude to another mass purge. But before Stalin could launch this new terror, death came for him. On March 1st, 1953, Stalin's guards found him collapsed on the floor of his room at his Kuntsevo dacha. He had suffered a massive stroke. His subordinates, terrified of him even in his helpless state, allegedly delayed calling doctors. When medical help finally arrived, there was little they could do. Stalin lingered for several days, unable to speak, before dying on March 5th, 1953. He was 74 years old. The official cause of death was a cerebral hemorrhage, though rumors persist that he might have been poisoned by those around him who feared another purge. The Soviet people were told that the great Stalin had died, and many genuinely mourned. Hundreds were crushed to death in the crowds trying to view his body lying in state in Moscow. But in the halls of power, there was relief mixed with fear. What would happen next? Who would rule? Stalin's death created a power vacuum, and his successors immediately began positioning themselves. Eventually, Nikita Khrushchev would emerge as the new leader, and in 1956, he would deliver his secret speech to the Communist Party Congress, denouncing Stalin's crimes, his cult of personality, and his purges. De-Stalinization had begun. Stalin's body was removed from Lenin's mausoleum and buried near the Kremlin wall. Statues came down. Cities named for him were renamed. The Soviet Union tried to move on from the Stalin era. But Stalin's legacy couldn't be buried so easily. He had transformed the Soviet Union from an agricultural society into an industrial and nuclear superpower. He had defeated Nazi Germany. He had built an empire that would last until 1991. But the cost was incalculable. Historians estimate that Stalin's policies killed between 9 and 60 million people, depending on what you count. The forced collectivization and famine, the Great Purge, the Gulag system, the deportations of entire peoples, the executions of party members, intellectuals, ordinary citizens. No number can capture the scale of human suffering. Families destroyed, talents extinguished, an entire society traumatized. So who was Joseph Stalin? How do we understand the man who signed death warrants while drawing doodles in the margins? The boy who sang in the church choir became the atheist dictator who destroyed churches. The poet became the censor who controlled what everyone could read or write. The revolutionary who fought for equality became the tyrant who lived in luxury while millions starved. The husband and father who couldn't maintain loving relationships became the leader who demanded absolute loyalty from millions. The man who read voraciously and had a sharp mind became the paranoid monster who saw enemies everywhere. Some historians portray Stalin as a rational actor pursuing Soviet national interests through brutal but effective means. Others see him as a psychopath driven by narcissism and paranoia. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Stalin was a product of his times, shaped by the violence and uncertainty of his upbringing, by the conspiratorial world of the revolutionary underground, by the brutal logic of the Bolshevik seizure of power and the civil war that followed. But he was also a man who made choices. At every turn he chose ruthlessness over mercy, terror over persuasion, control over freedom. He believed that the ends justified any means, that individuals didn't matter in the grand march of history, that breaking eggs was necessary to make an omelet. The tragedy is that many of the people Stalin killed were true believers in communism who had devoted their lives to the revolution. The old Bolsheviks who were executed had fought alongside Lenin. The peasants who starved had supported the revolution. The generals who were shot had built the Red Army. Stalin didn't just kill his enemies. He killed anyone who might possibly become an enemy. Anyone who had independent thoughts. Anyone who had known a world before Stalin. He created a system where everyone lived in fear, where neighbors denounced neighbors, where success was as dangerous as failure because it made you visible. The entire society became complicit in its own oppression. And yet, Stalin remains a controversial figure in Russia today. While most acknowledge his crimes, some Russians remember him as the leader who industrialized the country, who defeated Hitler, who made the Soviet Union a superpower. Public opinion polls sometimes show Stalin ranked among the greatest Russians in history. His legacy is complex and contested. The man of steel left behind a world of iron and blood, of monuments built on bones, of victory purchased with souls. As we conclude this journey through Stalin's life, from that one-room shack in Georgia to the pinnacle of power in the Kremlin, we're left with troubling questions. How does one person accumulate so much power? How do good intentions, assuming they ever existed, transform into totalitarian nightmares? How do ordinary people become complicit in extraordinary evil? And perhaps most importantly, could it happen again? Stalin died in 1953, but the capacity for totalitarianism didn't die with him. The mechanisms of control, the appeal of strong leadership, the willingness to sacrifice freedom for security or prosperity, these remain part of human nature. The man who called himself Stalin, the man of steel, turned out to be all too human in his paranoia, his cruelty, his need for absolute control. But the system he built and the suffering he caused were unprecedented in their scale. Stalin's story is a reminder that ideas have consequences, that power corrupts even those who claim to speak for the oppressed, and that the price of tyranny is paid in human lives, dignity, and dreams. The boy from Gori who wanted to be a priest became the dictator who built an atheist empire on millions of graves. And that empire, like Stalin himself, eventually turned to dust, leaving behind only ruins, memories, and warnings for those willing to listen.